Now I'm now about to stand up here and just use up time so Sandy runs out of time as my principal competitor. No, Sandy.
Actually, Jim did a great job of selling the virtues of the FiberZone switch in the FTTH with the latching. I have to. Your check is in the mail. I think I actually owe to Bill from Light Brigade. Larry, I think I still owe him money for planting you here with the redundancy question back at the beginning of the session. So my talk, as you see, is about redundancy, not test, although we do deal with a little bit of that. So it's a question that comes up a little bit. Is there a need for redundancy in fiber to the home? Typically there is none, right? It's just consumers, we don't really care. But there's always a few buts. First of all, we're also seeing increasing use of fiber to the home, FTTx and PON architectures for business users, and you have to care a little bit more about business users. And we're also seeing in some cases sort of these dense or condensed architectures where central offices are being kind of consolidated, and that raises questions. So in sort of maybe a second generation fiber to the home where you're serving business users or you have some of these types of condensed architectures, there's a lot more to lose if you lose some piece of the fiber to the home, either the OLT or the feeder fibers or so forth. So we're seeing this come up. So in this presentation, I just go through two cases from real live carriers, big ones, really, that are for whom their particular needs of their deployment, they have raised with us the desire for redundancy. So one of them is a large carrier that is, as I mentioned, interested in consolidating their architecture into a smaller number of denser COs, and we hear this a little bit actually in Wyoming. You mentioned earlier that you're considering it not exactly dense, but I mean we hear this all the time. If we had from big carriers, if we had to do it all over again, would we have this architecture where we have exchanges all over the place? Now that you have fiber to the home, the ability to reach, and frequently they say, well, not really. And this is actually an opportunity to, at least to a certain extent, re-architect the network around something that makes sense now, where you're deploying triple play. You have the benefits of fiber and the long reach. But it has implications if you do this. Number one, you end up with a huge number of fibers that are terminated in these sort of consolidated central areas, and they may be still going through these kind of remote. The physical plant may still be going through the path that they are going to today, because they have conduits in place or whatever. It's just that those now remote COs become passive or semi-passive. So the implication is if you have a cable cut, you may end up not with 32 or even hundreds of consumers out of service, but thousands or even tens of thousands of consumers out of service. If you're in a dense metro area, it can take a long time to locate and repair the cut, and you're then maybe losing revenue. You have angry customers, or even if you have business users, you might be subject to SLA penalties. So there's a need in this case to be able to, or if you had the capability to remotely move traffic from a cut resource to a spare resource, then you could avoid, in many cases, real financial impact. Again, particularly if it's dense, and particularly if you have business users. So this particular carrier is exploring an architecture in which it's a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is you have a number of working cables between a centralized CO and a number of remote COs, and you have a large number of LTs going through each of these cables, and the critical thing is that there's a number of diverse routes between the centralized CO and the remote CO, and those are in place. This is a carrier that has conduit between these locations today available, and all they want to do is the main driver is to bring the OLTs back into these centralized COs so that they're not out of the remote COs, so they have fewer teams in the field that have to have the training and capability to operate those. So it's sort of like a super PON network where you have the actives in these dense remote centralized locations. And then what they're going to do is within each of the working cables, within each of the four cables in this case, They have a number of working fibers and then a smaller number of spare fibers. And what they then set up is sort of a virtual protection scheme. This is actually not a separate cable. This is actually sort of a virtual protection. So if you lose cable number 2, for example, there are spares available in cables 4, 3, and 1 that can then carry that traffic. And this box here is actually a switch, and this box over here is a switch. And so it essentially is switching from each of these previously working cables, which are now cut, it's switching to the available spares in the other 3 actives. And in that way, in this case, they're losing a huge, if this was cut otherwise, they would lose an enormous number of customers. I mean, it would be 4 to 5 figures worth of customers. And in this case, rather quickly, they can set up a protection scheme or a redundancy scheme. And there's a finite number of actions that can occur. You can cut this one, you can cut this one, you can cut this one, or you can cut this one. Maybe there's a few more. And so you can actually have, as Jim mentioned, the ability to do batch files. We all have that capability. So you can sort of predetermine, okay, here are the events that could occur. If cable cut, this is an event. Cable 2 is cut. Here's the action that's taken. It can be automatic. It can just be initiated immediately upon recognizing the cut, or it can be sort of alarmed, semi-automated, where an alarm is set and a technician goes in, confirms indeed that's what took place, run this batch file, and off you go. So that's a first case scenario. There is another, the second one that I wanted to sort of briefly introduce is it's another new build, new PON build. It's again an incumbent carrier, and they came and said, okay, we would like to build in redundancy of the line cards, the OLTs, and the feeder fibers, and they wanted to. The reason is in the last. Well, no, I didn't have the reason. The main reason is that they're serving mixed customers. It's business and residential. And for both, actually, they'd like to explore redundancy, but at least certainly for the business customers. And they assessed a couple of alternatives. One is sort of a one-to-one redundancy scheme where you just have available extra line cards. And then another one is sort of a hybrid scheme in which you have one-to-N redundancy of the line cards and then either one-to-one or maybe one to a very small number N redundancy of feeder fibers. And to use a switch, what we call automated fiber management, to basically perform the switching between active working resources and redundant resources. And we worked up with a carrier business case to compare these alternatives. In the first one, you would have a full one-to-one redundancy. They would actually have 2 feeder fibers running from each OLT to the splitters, and they would there have a 2x32 instead of a 1x32, or it could be 2x16, but the 2 is the critical thing here, that it's accepting from 2 separate potential work fiber and a spare fiber. And then they have one-to-one redundancy on the OLTs. It's doable, obviously. You spend a lot of money on extra OLTs, clearly. It could be worth it, potentially, again, if they're serving business customers. You can choose. You don't have to do this everywhere. You can obviously pick and choose and say, okay, this is a business OLT. That's fairly simple because you usually have geographic diversity. And then you have, you have the test access capability. I'm not going to go into detail since we've talked a lot about test already today. But you still need a technician over here at the NOC that's running it, but you're also, in this case, going to have somebody here with no switching. You're going to have a technician in the CO that's going out to test the appropriate port. So you get, again, down here, so I don't know how easy that's to read, but you have to have a spare OLT for each working. You have automated recovery of a failed OLT. You can automatically switch to the OLT spare if you lose either the OLT up there or the feeder fiber on that PON, but you do need a dispatch or you need somebody at this location in order to troubleshoot. The second alternative is depicted here, in which you have a one-to-N sparing of the OLTs. Okay, this is enabled because you have a switch now. So you put a switch in the central office. You can have a one-to-N sparing of the OLTs. You, of course, connect all the fibers to the switch as well, the working and spare fibers. And so now you have automated recovery of both the OLT and the feeder fiber, but you're now one-to-N on the OLTs. And if you have, there is a, again, I don't think it's too easy to see down here, but there are now capabilities that are coming available to have test functionality that's actually integrated into the OLT itself. And in that sense, you don't actually need switching at all or coupling to get the test signal through to any of the feeder fibers. It's now integrated inside the OLT. So you can do fully remote monitoring and troubleshooting. And the switch is mainly now serving the redundancy function as well as the things that were raised in the last session. You now have, I think, the question of flexibility. If you're going to invest in this kind of an architecture with redundant feeder fibers, and the switching and everything else, and you've deployed all the fiber, you want this to be future-proof. You want to be able to have the flexibility. You don't know what's coming down the line. You might want to be able to support WDM PON later. You might want to, there's GPON today, but there's going to be a next-gen GPON. I mean, we're not done, right? There's going to be continued migration. So once you have a switch there, it's much easier to do technology upgrades. You can pre-deploy sort of the next-gen version and then decide, okay, that splitter over here has high usage because they're video junkies or whatever it is. We're going to upgrade them to the next GPON now and wait on these other two. So you really control and sort of extend the life of your existing technology and easily migrate to others. Or you can perform, in some cases, grooming. I didn't put this architecture in. Well, I did actually. You can, I think somebody mentioned before, the possibility of putting a 1x2 splitter in the CO, thereby having a much larger effective split ratio. Once you have the switch, you can move PONs on and off this 1x2 switch depending on bandwidth consumption, penetration rates, and so forth. And of course, the switches are transparent, as was mentioned, to signal. So you're never going to be impacted by the switch, depending on what kind of technology you're running through it. And now, I think, one little automation, you only need one technician here. There's no need to have a technician at the spare, and there's no need to use the switch for testing because you now have, if you have it integrated into the OLT. So in this case, we worked up a case with the carrier, and it was like, as in the case that Jim presented, the system pays for itself essentially immediately, mainly through equipment costs, but there's also the savings, and that doesn't even account for the savings that you get in remote troubleshooting or technology upgrade and grooming. All these things are savings that can be had. Again, I mentioned the adjustable split ratio, or the ability to groom and load balance across PONs, and you can perform the periodic monitoring if you want. Depending, just based on the functionality, the capabilities of the test system.
When I look at this, what is the experience availability that these large carriers have right now with regards to go into a one-end?
Well, this is a new build, so this is a carrier that really has almost no experience yet today. But what they want to do is be able to deploy a very similar architecture for both their business and their residential customers.
But they would have DSL experience, would they not?
Sure.
So that
extensive DSL.
Percentage of customers, when you look at an OLT versus a DSLAM, there is a difference in the number of customers that are on it, but you have an availability number with regards to your equipment. So I'm just curious the justification for doing the one-end redundancy.
Their justification basically is, first of all, they don't know yet what their availability is going to be because they haven't, and they want to be able to, they want to have the redundant capabilities anyway because they're probably not going to deploy it everywhere, but they specify we want to deploy it certainly for business customers. We want to be able to deploy PON. We want to be able to migrate to other technologies later, and we want to be able to provide redundancy so that we're not subject to loss.
So they're putting customers then, business customers, on a different OLT.
That's likely. Yeah, that's likely. They're evaluating architectures now, but usually that'll be the case because there's usually, you don't. Sometimes you have mixed use areas, but for the most part, you don't. You have, residential areas and
Been
Or-
there, done that, what it mean manage.
Well, but once you have, that's true. But everything now, Jim mentioned that, this is the last manual piece of the network, right? The physical layer is the last manual piece of the network. This is Verizon's quote. So, and once you have switching, then the ability to manage these things is a lot better. You can say, that guy, this port right here is a business port. This port right here is a 1x64 port that could be dialed back to a 1x32. You don't need the technician in the field to have all that knowledge or to know the flow chart, how he's going to do it. You can bake that intelligence into the network management system because now you have a switch. You don't need anybody touching the thing mechanically, manually. And that's sort of the name of the game.
I can see where this would be a possibility. So we're seeing more and more installations as far as MDUs, combining both businesses and condominiums architecture as far as hotels, motels, and so on and so forth. So we're going to have a combination of both types of networking. So would you see more of a switch being placed in this particular type of a situation as well?
In an MDU environment, particularly? Yeah, I think maybe the other presentation was an MDU presentation. Yeah, so we unfortunately, we missed that. But yeah, I think so. And I mean, in that, first of all, it's dense. Secondly, you have a controlled environment or a semi-controlled environment. So the power and environmental issues associated with switching. And you have this sort of mixed use, and you have churn rates, much higher churn rates in MDU environments. So I think we would all agree that an MDU, you may have a lot of them in Wyoming probably. Maybe the cows, have their different, right, but, and out in New Brunswick as well. I don't know, but. Okay. You know what we mean by MDU at least. So those environments absolutely, I think, are strong cases. Jim mentioned the NTT and Korea Telecom. It's all MDUs over there. They have the switching in the central office there. It's the case is strong, very strong. With that, I guess I'll hand it over. And
Thanks. I want to once more thank our sponsors, ADC, Corning, OSF, OFS, and make sure I get it correct. They're a sponsor. And then NTES, Inlight, FiberZone, CrossFiber, Pilatus, who was not able to join us, and then Caliant Networks. And I thank you all for your attendance and encourage you to get in touch with any of us. I encourage you to join the AFCS forum. It is a no-charge membership, and we do have engaging debates. We get together on a quarterly basis, a conference call, debate different topics. We have the subcommittees that were mentioned to concentrate on applications, talk about marketing applications, talk about regulatory. We had a number of conversations around stimulus packages and stuff like that. So get involved. It doesn't cost you anything other than a phone call once in a while. With that, any final questions? And I thank you very much for your time, and good night, afternoon.